See. Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see you all. My name is Marcy Slapkoff. I'm the director at the Office of Science Education. And I really want to thank you all for joining us today. It's a genuine honor to be part of this community that's so interested in teaching and learning. And I really appreciate that we're all taking a pause on this Friday afternoon to just learn something new together. It really feels like a luxury, and it's nice to be doing it with all of you and to see some familiar faces. Oh, I want to reach out to each one of you individually right now, but I have to contain my excitement. Maybe we can have a chance to meet up afterwards and debrief on this session. As many of you know, the SciLearn program is about helping students transition to university learning. And most of our activities are geared towards students, but instructors and staff are a very important part of the equation. And this speaker series is really designed to just help expose us all to some new ideas from the current researchers, scholars, thinkers in the area of higher education. So that's what today is about. And we're very pleased to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Sanjay Sarma, who Hilary Sweatman will introduce formally in a couple of moments. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Sarma speak. So really all that's left for me to say right now is a giant thank you to everyone who really enabled this event to happen. I'll start with thanking the Dean of Science, Bruce Lennox, who really supports teaching and learning innovation in so many different ways. I also want to thank the O's staff, many of whom are involved in getting this event organized, and to you all today. I especially want to give a shout out to Hilary Sweatman, the Science Education Fellow, who is the lead on this project, as well as two staff members, Armin Yazdani and Kira Smith, who you can see at the top of your screen, I believe, who have been very involved who lead the SciLearn program and are helping bring events like this to the community. I also want to thank our funder, Mary DiMazzo, and the DGDM Family Foundation for providing support for this program, financial, but also moral support in many different ways. And lastly, I just want to thank everyone who's here. Thank you so much for coming today and, just learning together and being part of this really incredible community that we have that extends far beyond McGill. So thanks to all of you, and I'll give it over to Hilary right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marcy. Hi, everyone. I'm Hilary. I'm a Science Education Fellow at the Office of Science Education. And I'm just going to start off with a quick land acknowledgement. So McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kenyan Kahaka and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe nations. So we recognize and respect that the Kenyan Kahaka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. It's important for us as educators to understand the ways in which Indigenous knowledge has shaped and continues to shape the way we study the world around us. And additionally, that Indigenous ways of knowing can inform our teaching practices and support rich educational experiences. So I will share with you a link to learn some more about the traditional custodians of the land that you reside on. Now I'm going to move to introducing our speaker today. So we have Dr. Sanjay Sarma joining us. Dr. Sarma is the former Vice President for Open Learning at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the author of GRASP. We're particularly excited to have him here today. As many of you may already know, Dr. Sarma's work has served as a great inspiration for the SciLearn program at the Office of Science Education. In addition to his work in education, Dr. Sarma is the Fred Fort Flowers and Daniel Fort Flowers Professor of Mechanical Engineering at MIT. He's also the co-founder of the Auto ID Center at MIT and developer of many of the key technologies behind the EPC suite and RFID standards now used worldwide. He serves on the boards of GS1US and the Hochschild Mining and several startup companies, including Top Flight Technologies. Dr. Sarma received his bachelor's from the Indian Institute of Technology, his master's from Carnegie Mellon University, and his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Sarma also worked at the Schlumberger Oilfield Services in Aberdeen, UK, and at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories in Berkeley, California. He has authored over 100 academic papers in computational geometry, sensing, RFID, automation, and CAD, and is the recipient of numerous awards for teaching and research. He advises several national governments and global companies. So a very impressive and diverse resume, and we're so looking forward to hearing his take on rethinking learning today. Just before I hand off, I'm going to mention that we actually have 2 copies of his book, Grasp, that we are really excited to be giving away to 2 of the attendees at random today. So we will be in touch afterwards about the winners. And with that, I will hand off to Dr. Sarma. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hillary. Thanks, Marcy, and thanks, Armin. Such a pleasure to be here. And can you see my slides?
Yes.
I gave a talk the other day where I forgot to, I put the slides up, but I didn't share them properly, and people are too polite to interrupt. So please don't be polite, and please interrupt. Look, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. I'm going to rant a little bit, forgive me. Let me start by saying that our educational system, wherever it is, we owe a great debt of gratitude to the ancient universities, and many of them were religious, you know, Buddhist universities, actually Islamic universities. The University of Qaravain in Morocco is probably the progenitor of some of the universities that ended up in Europe around the 1000 AD mark. And from there, we got the educational system we now practice. And if you look at this lecture, this is from Wikipedia, by the way, from 1308 in Bologna. You can see that what ails this lecture room is not that unfamiliar. You can see that there's one person who's had a late night and is spending too much time on their iPad, perhaps using Instagram. You can't really see the professor, but the professor is basically giving a lecture. You know, this is a lecture hall. So, so nothing really has changed. The term university even comes from actually an interesting thing. It doesn't come from universe, you know, that's not where it comes from. It comes literally, it is the name of a guild. It's a guild of scholars and teachers. And it gave the izazat, which is the Arabic word for permission to others to become scholars. It's literally a guild. Universitas means one truth. It was the guild. It's not universal. So academics are a guild, and we control the ability to teach. We still have a teaching license for school, right? Now, we don't have one for college, which is a whole other story, but that's where this effort becomes very important. And another way to think about it is when the Industrial Revolution occurred in Europe, you had to put these kids somewhere and daycare. And that's another reason that universities sort of took off. And the problem also, I mean, this is sort of a little bit of gallows humor for me, is that just as the Industrial Revolution ended up with interchangeable parts, I make the argument that college education, school education, I shouldn't say universities, was all about creating interchangeable people. And the point there is to sort of squeeze out any diversity of creativity and other things, and just make people a little bit like automatons. You know, that's my ranty part, by the way. And we shouldn't complain too much if robots replace us, because we just train to be robots, you know. And I think the opportunity and the need of the hour is to bring back the humanity into education. And for all that, university is super expensive. I mean, like super expensive, right? Student loans in the United States, student loan debt is $1.75 trillion. I actually gave this talk for Eric Mazur at Harvard, and he's got some wonderful papers on this. One of the things he did was map using EEG student brain activity in various settings, and it turns out that classrooms are worse than sleep. Okay, the brain activity in a classroom is worse than when you're sleeping or watching TV. I also do work in EEG separately, and it's interesting what you learn. That's how passivating the educational system is. So how did we end up here? And I talk about it in my book a little bit. It's sort of an interesting historical arc. We ended up here because of a battle between two giants, Thorndike and Dewey. And we tell the story in retrospect falsely. Okay, we all like to worship Dewey. Dewey is this great thinker, philosopher, very humane, humanistic, you know, humanist. And Thorndike was this guy who measured everything. He thought that teaching human beings was like teaching pigeons. and sort of missed the entire argument. The fact of the matter is, we talk a big game about pedagogy, the Dewey side, and I'll talk more about it. But actually, our systems are designed by Thorndike, and this is the tragedy we find ourselves in. If you look at, like in the internet, if you look at Wi-Fi, there's a stack. Somewhere there's some little RF chirps, and then higher up you have TCP/IP, and higher up you might have a web page, and that's called a stack. So similarly, the brain has a stack. Low down, you have neurons firing away, and then you have brain regions like the amygdala and the motor cortex and the occipital cortex, where different things happen. The occipital cortex is where reading happens. And then you have the whole brain, which puts all those little organs together, or sub-organs of the brain together. They call brain regions. And you get the beauty of the human brain, which is, by the way, an absolutely incredible thing, right? And the problem that we have today, and by the way, if you look at a worm, C. elegans, the C. elegans is just a few hundred neurons. It's 300 neurons, very simple. If you go up to a pigeon, you get to about 1 billion neurons, or 500 million neurons, in that range. By the way, if you're a cat lover, and my wife is, I have to tell you that cats have about half as many neurons as dogs, just for the record. And some birds have more neurons than cats and dogs. And then if you get to the human being, you get 86 billion neurons. It's a beautiful study that quantifies how many neurons there are in a human brain. It was done in Brazil. And this is the stack. And our brain is a little bit of a C. elegans, a little bit of a pigeon, but then all put together this magical thing called the human brain. And what happened with the behaviorists, people like Thorndike, is they couldn't actually, at that time in the 20s, they couldn't study human beings because they didn't have MRI, and people get upset if you cut their brains open while they're alive and so on. So they instead ended up studying pigeons and cats and things like that. Thorndike studied these things. And then he generalized to the human brain. That's the problem. Basically, he would train a pigeon to solve a puzzle to get out of a cage. And to him, that was what education was. And that's where they stopped. And our systems are designed that way. Dewey had the, shall we say, the wisdom to appreciate that actually the human brain and human capability is gloriously emergent. And we do amazing things. And he couldn't quite quantify it, he could say it, but he and later on another hero that we should worship is Maria Montessori. They understood that this approach of stopping here, which is what the behaviorists did, ain't right. And they worked on holistic classrooms. Dewey and his wife actually ran something called the New School in Chicago. And that's really what happened in the history of education, right? Dewey focused on social interactive learning, and Thorndike was much more focused on just training and conditioning, like as if you're teaching a pigeon. And you can also see from the shapes of their mustache that they're different personalities, right? And so this was Thorndike experiments, cats, pigeons, etc. Dewey created, a room with, a sandbox. We could shape things. This is what we know to be right today. But of course, our systems are all designed around this. Testing is designed around this, and so on. That's a tragedy. And there's this great quote from Ellen Conliffe Lagerman. She was the dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She says, one cannot understand the history of education in the United States during the 20th century unless one realizes that Edward L. Thorndike won and Dewey lost. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the burden we carry on our shoulders. Now, if you look at the history of education, in fact, I'm in India right now, and I went to a bunch of ancient universities as a tourist. And the Buddhist universities of India, Pakistan, actually the oldest is in Pakistan, called Takshila. That's this one. It sort of may have gone back to the 7th, 8th, even 10th century BC. I mean, we're talking about staggeringly old. I mean, you can see dorms, you can see people where people got lectures and so on. And then Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco, the 10th century AD, 11th century, you get the European university. And our universities that we're all used to today come from the European model, which includes, seminars and liberal thinking and labs from 1810. That's actually the Humboldt concept. Harvard was established in 1635, as you know, but the Humboldt concept arrived. Actually, in Lexington, Mass, where I used to live, was the first normal school. A normal school is where you teach teachers. The 1865 MIT was founded. This is actually the first chemical engineering chemistry lab in higher education. And then radio, video, and then 2020 we had COVID. And my great hope was that 2022 would be the year the lecture died. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen, because here I am doing it to you. And I apologize, but we don't have an option because we're still remote. I should also say that the Thorndike view also, people don't realize this, it also fed into racism. It's called scientific racism. In fact, Teachers College, Columbia, changed the name of that's where Thorndike was, changed the name of the building, Thorndike Hall, because Thorndike said it's all about behaviorism. And then he threw in this sort of random piece of racism about how race affected how capable an individual was. And this, in its own way, continued with SAT and so on. So as you probably know, SAT was reformed many years later. The concept of IQ, turns out, was a very false measure. So there's a lot of sociological consequences of that thinking, and a lot of scientific hubris, right? The idea that somehow you can, using limited science from the 1920s, suddenly define scientific education of Thorndike. The same thing also happened, by the way, with Taylor. He tried to introduce scientific management, was a disaster. If you've seen the movie Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin, unbelievable movie, it captures in a comical way, the tragedy of Taylorism, scientific management. And then Robert McNamara, the American Secretary of Defense for, Secretary of State, for Kennedy during the Vietnam War, tried to do scientific, manage wars, scientific wars. He would look at the number of body bags coming back and say, oh, it went down, so we're winning. Sort of ridiculous. So the scientific hubris sort of runs through our history. And Thorndike is just one example. Taylor and McNamara, two other examples. Okay, so how do we do it right? So it turns out our brain is a beautiful, complex, amazing piece of machinery, evolved over several billion years. And you can do searches. I grabbed this off the internet, but you can see the limbic brain, the prefrontal cortex, the occipital cortex, the hippocampus, the et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I just highlighted two things. In this picture highlights two things. One is the prefrontal cortex. That's the CEO of the brain. That's the adult. And by the way, children don't have it, and it only grows in ages 18 to 19, 20, 21, which is why it's such a formative period of a young person's growth. In my case, it never grew in, by the way. The limbic brain is where you have the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's where emotions live. And then there are all these other parts of the brain that give us these glorious, amazing, splendid things like empathy, insight, morality, intuition, fear modulation, reading someone else's expression, all that stuff. How do we know all this? What's happened? What happened in the last 50 years? Well, what happened was a beautiful, incredible piece of scientific breakthroughs. It started with Mossy, who first looked at the brain and realized any part of the human body, but particularly the brain. It's like, when you have a graphics processor in your laptop, if you're doing more video gaming, the graphics processor heats up. So just like that, the brain, depending on which part of the brain is doing more work, it sucks in more oxygen. And then Linus Pauling and Coriell found that oxygen-rich hemoglobin, because of course it's iron, is weakly repelled by a magnetic field. And then someone called Seiji Ogawa, Japanese, realized that you could use MRI to do that. And that led to something called blood oxygen level dependent contrast imaging. And then Bellevue, they used it for animal models, and Kwong was Korean, used it for human models. And suddenly now we can have someone play a violin and figure out which part of the brain is lighting up. And that's how we know now what brain regions are. And we're beginning to get these deep insights into the brain. And of course, you've seen my book. I also wrote a book that came out last year on workforce education. And thank you for Armin for talking about my book. So there are many, many, many key principles in education, and they range from mind wandering. People wonder, what is mind wandering? Well, it's exactly what you think it is. You know how you wag your finger sometimes at your kid and say, your mind's wandering. Well, it turns out it's actually a normal thing. Everyone's mind wanders. In fact, it's a good thing. Most situations. In some situations, mind wandering is not good if you cannot pay attention. But mind wandering also lets the brain relax and connect the dots. So it's not always a bad thing. It also creates creativity. The more technical term for mind wandering is default mode. The brain goes into that mode, by the way. And meditation is one way to control mind wandering. Unwanted mind wandering can lead to depression, and meditation is one way to address it, or mindfulness, which comes from a different tradition, but the two match up there. And there are all these other principles: retrieval learning, space learning, interleaved learning, faded examples, situated cognition, all that stuff. So I'll go through it very briefly, and I'll suggest that how many professors have even heard of it? And yet it is so essential to the way human beings ought to learn. And one of the findings that maybe I'll just say it right now, actually just cut to the chase and say that when I started this research many years ago and started writing my book, I thought we would end up with something super boring and clinical and inhumane. You must wake up at 6 a.m., you must exercise for 14 minutes and then eat 3 eggs and then study for 37 minutes, something really ridiculous. And actually what I found after finishing this research was that the lessons from the science of learning are amazingly intuitive. And they match precisely a human instinct. And that human instinct is parenting. In fact, learning is mankind's trade-off with evolution. We say we're highly flexible. We can live in the Sahara, we can live in the Arctic, and we can live in temperate zone. But then, unlike a zebra, which can run within 1 hour of being born, a human being is the prefrontal cortex, all the stuff grows in over a 20-year period. Excuse me, 15 to 20 years. And that's why we're so adaptable. But the trade-off is that we're actually learning animals. And parenting is a form of teaching, and learning is evolutionarily what children do. And all these things I'm going to mention, which you may have seen before, you will find familiar if you're a teacher. Sorry, if you're a parent, or if you were ever a small child, which I suspect most of you, certainly many of you were. This is a complicated graph, but I'll just tell you the mind-wandering thing. We did this with edX video. We found that if you increase, just look at the green chart, ignore the red chart, just look at the green chart. We found that if you increase the length of a video, if you make it more than 10 minutes, not only do people stop watching it, they actually give up much earlier. And it turns out that mind wandering, we know now from evidence, from research, separate research, kicks in at about 10 minutes. And what that means is every lecture should be 5, 10, 15 minutes. And of course, I've already exceeded that and violated that principle because the setup time is so great. The solution, by the way, that's one of the reasons online is good, because online you can shoot 15-minute videos. Now, I was talking to Sal Khan the other day, he's an MIT alum, and Sal Khan instinctively made all his videos, 10, 15, 20 minutes. He had no idea about the science, but you see our instincts are actually in the right place. But we violate all these things when we teach because it's convenient. And online helps you when people flip the classroom, it's about applying these principles more easily and then using the classroom to do what Dewey was doing, which is workshops, projects, discussions, things like that. Here's another one, the testing effects. So it turns out that if you study for, let's say, 10 minutes, and you take a test right after the 10 minutes, literally right after the 10 minutes, about the things you learned. And by the way, this is not a high stakes exam. You don't get graded. This is simply for your own edification. You will recall things much better 2 days later and a week later. You won't do as well right after 5 minutes. It's called effortful learning. Because you're retrieving things that you just studied for the last 5 minutes, you actually, for some reason, you do worse, but in the long term, it's better. And that's the testing effect. And we now know this, and we never practice it. Here's another one, space retrieval. It turns out that forgetting is an essential part of learning. When you learn, so this is a complicated graph. I'll come back to it in a second. I'll just talk about it first. When you learn something the first time, the brain wants to forget it. It absolutely wants to forget it. It does not want to remember. No amount of finger wagging and making the other person feel guilty is going to fix that. They do not want to remember. And the reason is, does any of you remember the temperature of the faucet when you went to the bathroom to brush your teeth this morning? You don't, because it's a pointless memory. So the brain is very lazy in not keeping memories. It considers pointless. And it turns out the way to signal to the brain that you need to remember stuff is to just at the edge of forgetting. When you start forgetting, if you remind the brain, then, so this is the orange is when you learn. You learn the first time, you're going to forget it really fast. Then you learn the second time, you forget it a little bit more slowly. Third time, you'll forget it slowly. And green is what is called the long-term memory curve. This gentleman is a German. His name is Ebbinghaus. He discovered this 140 years ago. And this is called space retrieval. So if you learn something and you keep relearning it with an increasing spacing, you learn it better. By the way, all the language programs like, Rosetta and all that, they apply this. Duolingo, they applied this, but we don't even know about in academia. You can do this online. It's much easier to do it online. So there are all these tricks you can do online. I'll come back to in person in a minute. If you just take those two effects, you can, this is a nice way to understand this that Clark Quinn came up with. So the idea is, if you learn quickly, like very fast, cram for an exam, you will do better on the day of the exam. So this is the day of the exam. This is 100%. This is learning scale, and this is time. So if you cram, right, you will do better on the exam of the day of the exam. But it's like a hot dog eating contest. You know what's going to happen the next day? You're going to lose it all. You're going to forget it. But if you do space retrieval and the testing effect, you learn slowly. You will remember longer in life. But actually, you won't do as well on the exam. So you see, even our exam systems are designed literally to give an advantage to people who cram. And then we complain about it, right? Why are you cramming? Why aren't you trying to understand? So this should be enough to retire the lecture, but yet, of course, we continue with the lecture. Here's another one, interleaved learning. It's a complicated picture, but I'll explain to you very briefly. So let us say that you are learning tennis. Let's start sports. And I hope all of you play tennis. It is a requirement to be a good teacher to play tennis. I'm being silly. And let's say that you're practicing your backhand, your forehand from the back court, baseline, your forehand volley, your backhand volley. So the question is, should you do backhand, or should you do backhand, forehand, volley, forehand, volley, baseline, forehand? It turns out that interleaving is much better, and this applies just as much to math. So this paper by Rohrer and Taylor, what they do is they have students calculate the area of a sphere, which is 4 pi r squared, and the area of a cone, which is 1/3 pi r h plus pi r squared. And it turns out that if you interleave, if you say sphere, cone, cylinder, sphere, cone, cylinder, you learn better than if you do sphere, cone, cylinder, cylinder. And the reason is the brain likes the contrast. So this is an example. These are the results. So this is the interleaved example where they do this. And this is block practice where they do the same thing, homogeneous. And long term, by the way, in the short term, you do better with block. But in the long term, you remember better with interleave. The block stuff goes away really fast. So this is called interleaving. And of course, we never do this. Every chapter in every book is going to be, the chapter on cones, chapter on spheres, and the chapter on cylinders. Never mix it up. But again, with online, you can do it. And by the way, again, Duolingo and stuff do this. We know so much about the brain and the circuits of the brain. We know a lot about dopamine. Dopamine is not, the root of dopamine is not dope, by the way. It's just a coincidence. It's a neurotransmitter. Most of you will know about this. It's like serotonin. And dopamine is this magic elixir of the brain, and it's triggered by curiosity, and it's triggered by novelty. And the story behind this is very interesting. This colleague of mine, actually, they're both colleagues, Susan Whitfield Gabrielli and John Gabrielli. The two of them looked at learning, and they found a certain brain condition which they couldn't figure out what it was, led to better learning outcomes. And it was actually, I sent them this paper many years later, 2014, when it came out. It's a group in California, and they were able to name that brain condition that led to better outcomes. And it turns out that brain condition is curiosity. So it turns out if you make someone curious, the brain releases dopamine and you learn better. And every parent knows this, right? Every parent knows about the 10-minute lecture. Every parent knows about the testing effect. Every parent knows about the spacing effect. And every parent knows that your kid sitting in the back of the car, when you make them curious, tell them stories, boom, they're turned on to learning and they learn better. And that's because just like hunger generates saliva, the brain generates dopamine when you teach them stuff in a certain way with curiosity. This is an amazing thing. Actually, the person who wrote the most about this is Sean Bialek. Sean Bialek just became she's much younger than me, she just became the president of Dartmouth College. And she is a psychologist. She was at, I've forgotten where she was, maybe the University of Chicago. And then she went to Barnard College, where she was the president. And she wrote a bunch of papers about something called called embodied cognition. So it turns out if you learn something, if you make gestures like the right-hand rule, or if you learn vectors, you walk them out, you just learn better. This is actually a pushback on the Descartesian philosophy that pervades Western philosophy. Descartes was actually trying to protect Galilean thinking from, at that time, the church trying to shut down his thinking. And he, with good intentions, tried to separate the mind and the body. The problem is, it turns out the reality is that if you combine mind and body, if you actually have gestures, they engage the motor cortex. And if you engage the motor cortex, you learn better overall. And so the mind-body connection, which you see in yoga and things like that, turns out to be true in learning as well. I mean, it's amazing. I can go on and on and on. I truly am capable of doing that. But in the interest of time, what I'll do now is talk about a couple of other things, and then talk about more practical what to do with learning and how to think about learning. So there's a beautiful book written by Anders Ericsson, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, 2 years ago, called Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. I recommend you read it. And what he talks about is how you become an expert. And he studied, it's a book he studies, but he also quotes other people's studies on how you can teach physics. And he talks about, this is actually by, this paper below is by Carl Wyman, who's a Nobel laureate. He's at Stanford University. He's someone I'm talking to about something. The idea is, it's called a deliberate practice. And I'll come back to Peak in a second, but the basic idea is when students are novices, when they're learning, you want to give them training wheels. And the training wheels should be low. But as they become experts, you can start lifting the training wheels and give them coaching so that they fix their technique. And if you can do that on a systematic level, you can make a much larger fraction of students experts. Bloom wrote about it too. He called it the 2 sigma effect. And what Peak talks about is a very beautiful thing. It's about perfect pitch. So Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was considered a genius, which he was. But the mistake was that at that time, people thought in Europe that he had a God-given gift of perfect pitch. He could hear a pitch and absolutely nail it. What Peak talks about is how in Japan, they were able to achieve perfect pitch for a large number of students by applying deliberate practice. The Suzuki method is one example of that. And so what that means is that does not have to be a God-given gift. Proper teaching can make something that appears a God-given gift, make it scalable. And this is why, in sports, for example, if, take, for example, squash, a sport I follow, the Pakistanis, Jamshed Khan, Jahangir Khan started winning, and suddenly they won every contest, and every year there was a new champion. And now the Egyptians are doing it. And that's because when you have a community of experts who can coach each other, they get better. And this is called deliberate practice. And this is really what we ought to be doing in education. And none of this is compatible with the way we teach today. Our guild is strong. I put this painting up for two reasons. One, it's a painting of a guild. And two, it's a painting, I believe, by Rembrandt, who did not learn to paint through a guild. He learned to paint by deliberate practice. Michelangelo never attended a lecture, but yet the Pieta is amazing and the Sistine Chapel is stunning because he did deliberate practice. And yet today, the lecture pervades everything. And the big mistake is this. We assume that the professor has a pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper, and all the professor has to do is write on the sheet of paper and declare victory. And that's not true. Really, the way to think about it is the student is formulating a model of the world. And the professor should feed, it's like a tree growing, it's a plant growing. The plant wants water, you give it water. When you need sodium, you give it sodium. Need potassium, nitrogen, you give it nitrogen. You don't just give it all the water it needs for its lifetime on day one and declare victory. And that's sort of how we teach today. And that's the flaw that we need to get over. So if you look at how we teach today, I list here all the principles, lectures, get rid of them, right? Retrieval effect, it's a beautiful thing. Spaced repetition, interleaving, faded examples is like that thing with scaffolding, the bikes. Anyway, curiosity, coaching, hands-on learning, all these things. What we do today, unfortunately, is we waste lecture time in the on-site classroom because it's better for exams. That's what we're really preparing for. And all the stuff that we should be doing, we just don't do it because we waste lecture time doing this. Now, during COVID-19, this got exposed in a big way. I wrote an article in the World Economic Forum saying, guys, if you think this is online education, please understand it is not. This is not what we mean. This is not online education. And instead, what I said in the article is proper online education is not live lectures done in Zoom. Proper online education is asynchronous
transcription,
lectures.
translation, universal genetic code, ribosomes, all very simple. This time we're going to talk about all the variations on the theme. So it turns out that, well, I think I've already said, life likes tweaking the things. Almost anything gets tweaked, optimized, and changed. And now that you have a pretty good handle on how DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein, I now want to throw some curveballs at you, throw some of the complexities.
Oops. So what this is Eric Lander, who's an advisor to the White House, he's an MIT professor. He sequenced led one of the two groups to sequence the human genome. Giving a lecture, most students watch it at 1.25 or 1.5x speed. There is a transcript. They can go fast, they can read it slowly, they can search the transcript. This ain't that, but that's what we got in COVID. But if you do this, then you can start rethinking the classroom, because now what you can do is your in-person lecture is replaced by a wonderful 20-minute, 15-minute, 10-minute online lecture with all those tricks thrown in, all the things you didn't do, you can do online. Your retrieval effect, spaced repetition, interleaving, faded examples. And then what you do is, remember, now this is gone, right? The things that you could not do in the lecture, what you should have done, you make the time to do right. And that's context, curiosity, intent, coaching, hands-on learning, and all that stuff. And so what I'm presenting here is what I view as a sort of a multi-dimensional flipped classroom. And this is what we have done at MIT, which is, when COVID and finally really confiscated our right to be together. And it's finally releasing that grip. And when it eventually completely releases that grip, we've got to make the classroom count. We cannot go back to doing in person what we were doing in Zoom, which is boring the daylights out of students, as I'm doing to you right now, and wasting that precious in-person time. So I'm going to stop here. I think I've spoken for about 40 minutes, maybe 37 minutes. but it'll leave some time for questions. Thank you very much. I'll take the slides down and I'm happy to take comments, questions, disagreements, agreements, haikus, anything. Back to you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. You've definitely left us a lot to think about. We do have some time now for questions. Like you said, we'll take questions until about 2 minutes to 2.